it's a special privilege to be the first speaker of the International Center for Consciousness Studies. I think I've been given the warm-up act because I'm going to be talking about a topic that is usually taught to first-year undergraduate students. Philosophers of mind don't usually pay very much attention to substance or Cartesian dualism. They tend to talk about dualism generally without saying exactly what it is. It's something that, again, we teach our students. If you teach a philosophy of mind course, you start often by talking about substance dualism, sort of in order to get it out of the way, to set it aside, because it's a distraction from the real issues that philosophers of mind want to talk about, which is to do with the nature of the mental. Is it working now? I find the view really interesting as a metaphysician. But again, it's considered to be a sort of beginner's topic, so that's why I'm the warm-up act. So the view, Cartesian dualism, says two things. It says, I can't see it, oh, there I can see it, okay. It says that thinking things are entirely immaterial. And by a thinking thing, I mean a thing that has mental properties, consciousness, belief, memory, preferences, anything like that, a thing with a mental life. And by immaterial, I mean not made of matter, not having physical properties like mass, temperature, volume, and so on. Okay, so thinking things are entirely immaterial, and what we call a human being, for example, is really two things. There's an immaterial thinker, which is traditionally called the soul, and there's a body, and a body is a biological organism, a physical object. But the body is not itself a thinking thing. No one supposes that what we call a human being is really a thinking soul and also a thinking body, as if they were two different thinkers competing for control over my arms and legs. The body doesn't think. It couldn't possibly think. A physical organism can no more think than a stone could think. It has, and more generally, no material thing has any mental properties. It's impossible for a material thing to think. In some sense, it's impossible anyway. It's impossible in the sense that this lectern cannot think. That's impossible. And what goes for us goes for all sentient beings. So pigs and chickens, for example, are really two things. The chicken consists of an immaterial thinking substance or soul, which is the thing that's conscious and the thing that the animal rights people are concerned about. And there's the biological organism, which, as Descartes says, is just a sort of machine, but it has no mentality in itself. That's the view, okay, that we teach our undergraduate students about. Okay, now, nearly all Cartesian dualists, including Descartes himself, say that the soul and the body interact. So my intentions or acts of will move my body. So my body obeys my orders, to some extent at least. If I want to raise my arm usually goes up. And likewise, this animal's sense organs produce non-physical sensations in me that enable me to perceive the physical world. So the soul and the body communicate, they exchange information. So the body interacts with the soul in something like the way that a remote-controlled drone interacts with its human operator. The body gives the soul information about its surroundings, much as the drone gives the operator information from its camera. So the it's got a little video screen, okay, and it perceives through the drone's camera, so to speak. And likewise, my body obeys my commands in much the way that the drone moves according to the way that the operator moves the little joystick on the control thingamy. Okay, and the most common objection to Cartesian dualism is that this communication is mysterious or impossible. How could something completely non-physical in an immaterial thing make something happen in the body? And likewise, how could something physical in the body cause some sort of change in the soul? This is the traditional objection. It was made during Descartes' lifetime in the 17th century. Curiously, this is just as much an objection to the claim that there is a God, an immaterial God, who intervenes in the physical world. That would also be a case of an immaterial thing somehow, a non-physical event somehow causing changes in the physical world. But no one, to my knowledge, ever objects to theism on these grounds. But that, I won't go into this little aside. Okay. But in any event, it's clear that the soul, if there is a soul, interacts with the body in lots of other ways as well. And it's these other ways that I want to talk about now. So most obviously, the soul cannot function without a healthy nervous system. And this is where head injuries come into it. So suppose you get hit on the head, okay, pretty hard, but not hard enough to kill you. What happens? Well, yes, if your mental life takes place in the soul, which communicates with the body, you might expect this damage to the body to stop the interaction between the soul and the body, right? So the body would stop obeying your commands, and you'd be paralyzed, yeah, and you wouldn't get any more sensory information. So everything would go dark, right? So it would disrupt the exchange of information, but you want to remain conscious and wonder what was happening and whether you were ever going to recover and so on. It would be like damaging the remote control drone, right? If it got hit by a bird, let's say, you might expect that to disrupt its communication with the operator. So maybe the screen showing the pictures from the drone's camera would go dark, and the drone might stop responding to your commands, okay? But you wouldn't expect anything more to happen. You would expect to remain conscious. But of course, that's not what happens when you get hit on the head. It stops all mental activity completely. Okay. Sorry. Yes. And yes, head injuries stop all mental activity completely. And other things like alcohol or other intoxicants in your blood, they don't stop your mental activity, but they slow it down and they hinder your mental activity. And this is all quite surprising if mental activity is entirely non-physical and goes on in an immaterial thing, quite separate from the organism. It's not what we would expect. It's as if damaging the remote control drone rendered its operator completely unconscious, as if the drone operator could not function unless the drone itself was functioning. That's not what we expect, not how we expect drones and their operators to behave. Sorry, I'm old-fashioned. My information, my notes are on paper and not on something electronic and more efficient. Maybe one day I'll learn. So these head injuries show that, and the same thing happens with general anesthesia, though in a less damaging way. And this shows that the body and the soul have to be much more intimately connected than a drone and its operator. It's clear that the body gives the soul something that it needs in order to function. It's something, the soul is a bit like a light bulb, and this is actually a simile that Cartesian dualists themselves often give. The light bulb cannot light up without a source of electricity. Likewise, the soul cannot function without something, whatever it is, we don't know, that it gets from the body. So the soul's activity depends on the body in the way that the light bulb's activity depends on its source of power. Okay. Here's something else that we observe. Physically normal organisms always have a normal mental life. You never find a physically normal human being with no mental life at all, completely unconscious. If a relative of yours was completely unconscious and the doctor told you that there was nothing physically wrong with her, there's no physical cause of her unconsciousness, well, you would be astonished. You would look for a different doctor, probably. So every normal organism has got a normal mental life, and it must therefore have an immaterial soul. And likewise, similar brains are always correlated with similar mental lives. You don't find a human organism with the mental life, a normal adult human organism with the mental life of a small child, or the mental life of a dog or a chicken. Normal human beings have always got normal human mental lives. And more generally, we never find a mental difference without a physical difference. We can make this vivid by imagining a duplicating machine. Does anyone know Calvin and Hobbes? It's an excellent comic strip from way back in the 1980s, in the days of my youth. So you can imagine that we have a duplicating machine, a machine that will make a perfect physical duplicate of any material object. Okay, and Calvin uses the machine to make a duplicate of himself and asks the duplicate to do his homework and his household chores and so on. But of course, the duplicate is no more willing to do those things than Calvin himself was. So his experiment was a failure. But the point is, if we made a physical duplicate of you, we would expect that duplicate to have a mental life, to be conscious. And more precisely, we would expect it to have the same sort of mental life as you have. Okay, and all of this is quite surprising given Cartesian dualism. You wouldn't expect the mental and the physical to be correlated in such a precise way. It would be perfectly possible for a normal human organism or body to have no soul at all, okay? Or for a human organism to have the soul of a dog or a chicken, or for the duplicate of you made by Calvin's machine to have no soul, or to have the wrong sort of soul. You would expect the assignment of souls and bodies to be random. But that's not what we find. So the dependence, so we observe that the soul and the body don't just interact, but they're intermingled in a much more intimate way. So you can't have a mental life without a normally functioning nervous system. Every animal with a normally functioning nervous system has a mental life. Physically similar animals have similar mental lives. And this is just what we would expect if mental activity were a sort of physical activity in the brain, right? It's not just that that what goes on in the brain causes your mental life, but that it is your mental life. That's why stopping brain activity stops your mental life. That's just what we would expect if the things that we observe are just what we would expect if mental activity were a special case of physical activity, and therefore if thinking things were material things, just the opposite of what Cartesian dualism says. It's not what we would expect if mental activity were an entirely non-physical activity in an immaterial soul. Again, in that case, we would not expect to see any correlation between mental differences and physical differences. And this, I think, is the biggest worry for Cartesian dualism. If I were a dualist, or if I were sympathetic with Cartesian dualism, this is what would keep me awake at night. Okay. So, yes, there has to be more to the dualist story than unthinking bodies, thinking souls, and communication between them. They don't simply relate like drones and their operators. Certain questions, hard questions, arise. Why is the soul unable to function without the body's help? This is a question that dualists ought to worry about. What is it that the body gives the soul that enables it to think? So you would expect the soul to be able to function without the body, given that its activity is entirely non-physical, and it's a wholly immaterial thing, and yet that's not the case. What does the body give the soul? That is, what sort of help does the soul need from the body? Why do we never find a healthy body without a soul? And why do physically or neurally similar bodies always have psychologically similar souls? Okay. Now, dualists commonly answer this question by saying that the body or the nervous system creates a soul and sustains it in being. So the body produces the soul, and this is a natural process. Okay, they say it's like an electric current in a coil of wire producing a magnetic field. That's just happens in the course of nature. The body produces the soul like that. So brain functioning is not just causally necessary for there to be a thinking soul, but it's sufficient as well. The body produces a soul all by itself. So the reason why that physical duplicate of you would have a mental life like yours in the Calvin and Hobbes example is that the duplicate would create a soul like yours. So the duplicating machine creates a physical organism just like your body, and that new body creates a soul just like yours, right? And likewise, similar bodies create similar souls. And this view has come to be known as emergent dualism, and virtually all contemporary Cartesian dualists are emergent dualists, and they're quite happy with this view. It has the further example of solving Jaegwon Kim's pairing problem, or at least giving an answer anyway. The problem is what pairs up souls and bodies? Why is it that I'm able to move this particular organism and not that one or that one or that one? And why is it this organism's sense organs that give me information and not some other organism's sense organs? Why is it only one organism that I can move? That is, the immaterial soul, can move, and not two or three. Why is it always the same one? It's always the same old body that I can move, and never a different one on different days. These are striking phenomena which cry out for explanation. And the emergentist answer is the reason is that this organism, this body, has created this soul, me, this thinking substance, and now sustains me in being. That's why this soul is attached to or can move this body and not any other body. So asking what pairs up the souls in the bodies is a bit like asking what pairs up magnetic fields with coils of wire, right? It's not really a question because of this causal connection between them. Okay? The alternative to emergent dualism would seem to be that the Supreme Being miraculously creates a soul whenever there's an appropriate body, okay, and attaches the soul to the body. This is the Supreme Being here on the upper right, as the famous Italian artist depicted him. And the Supreme Being, so when a human organism or a dog or a chicken reaches the appropriate stage of development, the Supreme Being creates a soul and attaches it in the sense of establishing all of these causal connections that I've been talking about. And he always attaches a soul with mental properties that match up or correlate with the physical properties of the organism. So in the duplication experiment again, the reason why the physical duplicate of Calvin is also a mental duplicate is that the Supreme Being has a policy of always attaching an appropriate soul to any physical object. So he, as soon as the duplicate was created, the Supreme Being attached a soul to it. I think Descartes was an interventionist. This was his view, I think. I don't know of any contemporary dualists who accept this view. All right, once again, emergent dualism is very commonly held, and the Cartesian dualists are quite happy with it. I think they shouldn't be so happy. I think it's rather worrying, though very interesting as well. The view makes two very surprising claims. First of all, obviously, it implies that ordinary physical processes create thinking substances ex nihilo, from nothing. So the nervous system does not just produce a certain sort of activity, mental activity, say. The soul does not consist merely of mental activity. The soul is a substance. That's what the view says. That's why it's called substance dualism. A substance meaning something that is not itself a sort of activity or aspect or property of something else. It's a self-standing object. That's a substance. If the mental activity that your brain produced were not the activity of an immaterial soul, it would have to be the activity of the brain or of the organism, at least assuming that mental activity must be the activity of something, and all dualists will accept that. Okay, so in that case, it's the activity of the organism, and in that case, it's the organism or the brain that is thinking, and that's materialism, just precisely what the dualist denies. So it's not like creating a dancer by moving in a certain, so it's not like creating a dance by moving in a certain way. Right, you know. That's not how it is. It's like it's creating a dance by creating a dancer. Okay? So the body produces mental activity by creating a new thing that engages in that activity. Okay, and unlike creating a dancer in the usual way by sexual reproduction, the body creates this thinking thing out of nothing and not out of any pre-existing material. So that's why I call it creation ex nihilo. Okay, that's quite surprising. Okay, here's a second surprising claim that the view makes, that although pigs and chickens have the extraordinary power to create thinking things out of nothing, they lack the ordinary power of thinking. So they cannot, again, it's part of the view that no material thing could think. So an organism's neural activity can only produce mental activity in something else. The brain or the organism can produce thinking only by creating a new being and causing it to think. But the organism cannot itself think, right? So the chicken or the pig has got the power to create a new thinking thing from nothing, but it hasn't got the power to think itself. So it attributes to material things a surprising combination of godlike powers and radical disabilities. It has to, so the chicken has got the godlike power to create a new thinking substance, but it lacks the ordinary power to be conscious, to have conscious experience, or to have beliefs or memories or anything like that. So I think this combination of claims is very surprising. It's strange enough to say that the chicken can create a thinking substance. It's strange to say that the chicken can never be conscious, but it's especially strange to say both at once. Okay, so emergent dualism raises, so it answers certain questions. It's a rather powerful view in many respects. So it tells us where the soul comes from, right? The soul is produced, created by the nervous system, much as a magnetic field is produced by an electric current through a coil of wire. Okay. What matches up souls with the bodies? Well, again, the body creates the soul and sustains it in being. Again, like a coil of wire and a magnetic field. It tells us why physically normal animals of the right sort always have mental lives. It's because the animal produces a thinking substance and enables it to think by a natural process. And the reason why physically similar animals have similar mental lives, why human animals never have the mental lives of chickens, for example, because those mental lives have similar causes. Human organisms always produce human souls. Canine organisms always produce canine souls, and so on. So it answers these questions, but it raises other hard questions that it doesn't answer. So how does the body create a thinking substance out of nothing and sustain it in being? How does it work? We know how coils of wire create magnetic fields when electricity runs through them, but we don't know how a brain creates an immaterial substance and sustains it in being. Why can't the soul think without the body's help? Again, this is surprising. You would expect an immaterial thing to engage in its non-physical activity quite independent of what happens in the physical world. So we don't know. We're told where the soul comes from, but not why it needs the body in order to think, right? It needs the body in order to exist, but we're not told why it needs the body in order to think in the first place. How does the body enable the soul to function? What sort of help does the body need from the soul? What does the soul give the body besides just sustaining it in being that enables it to think? We don't know. And why can't the body itself think? Why is it impossible for any material thing to be conscious? Now, dualists, this is in addition to the more familiar traditional questions that arise about substance dualism, namely how the body and the soul communicate or interact, and why the soul it cannot be observed or detected by scientific instruments. That's surprising, given that the soul can move the body, but it never shows up in any scans or in any other way. It's completely elusive. Those are the familiar questions. All right. So the dualists have had something to say about question 9, how the body and the soul communicate, and they've had something to say about question 8, why the body cannot itself have mental properties. So their account of, if you ask, how do the soul and the body communicate? Well, the answer is, we don't know. But we shouldn't expect to know. All causation is mysterious, and we can't know a priori what can cause what. It's only experience that tells us what events can cause what other events. But the fact that what happens in the soul causes something to happen in the body and vice versa, that doesn't conflict with our experience, so there's no objection here. Sometimes we can explain causal interaction in terms of some more fundamental feature. For example, heat transmission is explained in terms of molecular motion. You put the pot on the fire, it heats up. Why? Well, it's something to do with the motion of all those molecules. Okay, but if you ask why the molecules behave in that way, that's more difficult. At some point, it comes down to basic physical laws. Okay, and the interaction between the soul and the body is not likely to be explainable in terms of something more basic, like tiny parts of the soul and tiny parts of the body. It's likely to be a completely basic psychophysical law. So it will not be explainable. It won't be like, it will be like the behavior of elementary particles, right? Why do electrons repel each other? Well, they just do. And that's all there is to it. So there's no legitimate a priori objection to the interaction between the soul and the body. This is the usual answer to the question how the soul and the body communicate. Okay, or not response, not answer. We don't answer the question, we just say we don't need to answer it. We shouldn't worry about it. What about the other question? Why can a body or a material thing not think or be conscious? Here, dualists commonly appeal to a priori arguments. Okay, the very idea of a material thinker is unintelligible. Leibniz very famously made this vivid by imagining a physical object blown up to giant size so that you could walk around it like visiting a factory or a mill, and you would see all these parts pushing and pulling against one another. You would see all sorts of mechanical machinery, but none of this machinery could possibly account for anything mental. You're looking for the mental in the wrong place, Leibniz said. So we can see a priori that no physical activity could ever be mental activity or produce mental activity. That's the usual answer to that question. And I'm not saying that this is a good or a bad answer, but I think this is perhaps the most intuitively powerful argument for Cartesian dualism. Most of the arguments for it are rubbish, as we teach our first-year students. Okay, but whatever the merits of that argument, emergent dualists cannot give that argument. And the reason is that it's their view that physical activity does produce mental activity. It produces it in a soul. Somehow that physical activity creates an immaterial soul and enables that soul, causes that soul to think. But if a material thinker is unintelligible, if we can see a priori that it couldn't happen, then a material thing's enabling an immaterial soul to think is equally unintelligible. That also ought to be impossible for the same reason. The same goes, by the way, for interventionist dualism. If we can know a priori that an immaterial thing couldn't produce thinking, what was I going to say? Then it ought to be equally unintelligible how this divine immaterial thing, the higher powers, could I've forgotten what I was going to say here. I'll have to look at my notes. So I'm going to skip that point because I've forgotten what it was. It will come to me afterwards. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so again, the dualist cannot explain why a material thing cannot think by appealing to a priori arguments of the Leibnizian sort. What they should probably say is that, well, it's just a contingent law of nature. All of these questions, these hard questions, are just, well, part of the natural phenomenon of the relation between the soul and the body. They're governed by contingent laws of nature, laws that we can only discover by observation. We shouldn't expect to be able to answer these hard questions a priori. So why can't material things think? Why can't the soul think without help? Why can't it think unaided? How does the brain's neural activity create a soul and enable it to think? Right? How does the brain create the soul and then enable the soul to think? Well, the answer is these things just happen. That's how it is. That's what we observe. It's just a natural process, but we cannot expect to understand this natural process a priori. It's just a fact that we observe. I think this is quite a troubling response for the dualist. If we have to concede that the body enables the soul to think in a mysterious way, mysterious in that we cannot understand it a priori, then for all we know, the body might think in a mysterious way. If the production of thought and consciousness are mysterious and understandable only a posteriori, understandable only from observation, then well, we have to be guided by empirical observation generally in the whole area. Okay, we can't know a priori how the mind functions, so to speak. We can only know it by observation. But of course, there's no empirical evidence for Cartesian dualism, not that I know of anyway, or virtually nothing. That's why the arguments for Cartesian dualism are nearly always a priori. We're supposed to be able to know a priori just by thinking that thinking things have to be immaterial. And these arguments are now threatened because the a priori arguments for substance dualism seem to rule out emergent dualism, and they don't, they leave us with no account of the things that we observe, like the effect of head injuries on your mental life. So this is my last slide. The traditional arguments for Cartesian dualism, the arguments that we teach our first-year students, they go like this. They say that you and I have some special property that no material thing could have. Okay. For example, I've got the capacity to exist in a disembodied condition. Or I could survive having all of my atoms replaced in a period of 2 seconds. Or I've got a certain special sort of free will, or whatever, okay? And no material thing could have this property. No material thing could exist disembodied, or survive the rapid replacement of all of its matter, or have radical free will, or whatever. But these arguments are now threatened if we have to say that if we have to fall back on empirical observation in the philosophy of mind. Again, the claim was that the reason why a material thing can never be conscious is just, well, it's some irreducible law of nature that we can't know a priori. That suggests that it's at least metaphysically possible for a material thing to think. It's only prevented from thinking by a contingent law of nature. Okay, that's a troubling concession. If it's possible, metaphysically possible, for a material thing to think, then for all I know, I'm a material thing. A material thing could have a mental life like mine. It could have the very same reason to suppose that it could exist disembodied, or that it had radical free will, or whatever. It would have the very same evidence for substance dualism that I've got. Okay, but of course, this material thinker would be mistaken. So why suppose that we ourselves are not in this situation? For all we know, we might be these material thinkers that have these mistaken dualistic intuitions. And it's not as if this possibility, that is, that the possibility that material things think, it's not as if this is some sort of radical skeptical scenario that we can ignore. It's not like Descartes' evil demon giving us illusory sense impressions as of a physical world that doesn't exist. It's not a weird skeptical scenario that we can set aside. In fact, it's precisely what the evidence supports, it seems. It looks like dualistic accounts of what happens in head injuries threaten to undermine the main arguments for dualism in the first place. Okay, so head injuries, what happens in head injuries suggests that there's a very intimate connection between the soul and the body. The nature of this connection, it seems, cannot be explained or understood a priori. We have to fall back on empirical observation. That undermines all the arguments for dualism. That's my lesson. Okay, thank you very much.
I'm very honored and pleased to be here in Siena in this very fantastic scenario. So that definitely brings something to our consciousness. So here's the plan of the talk. I would like to defend the idea that being an experience in the traditional Cartesian sense that has been reprised, for instance, in the Cambridge tradition in the end of the 19th century, can be the mark of the mental, right? That is the necessary and sufficient conditions in order for something to be mental. And I don't want to defend this idea, but I want to show that supporting this idea, sustaining this idea, makes it the case that consciousness might play a certain particular role in it. Because being an experience has to do with having a phenomenal character in the phenomenally manifest sense, in the sense of what it is like to entertain a particular state. And since this entails the fact that if something has a phenomenal character, then it is something one is phenomenally aware of, which is an idea that has been defended by many people in recent times. Now it's defended, for instance, the last defender of this idea is Martina Nieder-Rümelin, but there is a long tradition in that. Then one can show precisely that consciousness is involved here, at least in a particular sense. And of course, this has some possible drawbacks that one has to face. That is the fact that if one goes in this traditional way, one has to rule out of the realm of the mental, the so-called unconscious mental states, for which, at least in the sense of being unconscious, there is a sort of evidence that is no longer a philosophical or a psychological evidence, but even an empirical evidence, since it has been shown that there are unconscious states that are relevant for the mind. But I think that one can swallow this kind of consequence, because this is something that I want to deal in this paper, because I've tried to show in different occasions in which one might say, well, even if one, of course, have to say that unconscious states or the relevant unconscious states are not mental, if the mark of the mental is being an experience, nevertheless, one can show that maybe there is a revolt here on behalf of the unconscious mental state. Oh, no, okay. Okay, so I want to deal with this problem because I think that there is a positive way of accommodating this idea that unconscious states, even though they are not mental, can play a role with respect to mental life. But what I want to be concerned with is precisely to give a positive account of what it is being an experience and therefore being phenomenally aware of consciousness, because I will try to show that being phenomenally aware is the way in which, or contributes to the way in which a particular property, which can be either mental or non-mental, is predicated of a subject. This will be the main idea. And by means of that, I will hopefully show how can it be the case that being an experience can be the mark of the mental. Okay. So, okay, I assume this idea, that is that being an experience is the necessary and sufficient condition for being the mark of the mental. As I told you, I want to skip the problem of how to account for allegedly unconscious mental states, because I think that one can show that unconscious states are not mental, and nevertheless they contribute, they play a causal role, or anyway a motivational role with respect to mental life. Because of lack of time, I want to deal with this problem, but I will focus on the second problem, which seems to me very relevant. That is, if I stick to the idea that being an experience is the mark of the mental, and I do not cash out what being an experience amounts to, then it is possible that in some sense unconscious states comes back from the rear door, because there is, as you well know, a possibility of accounting for what being phenomenally aware amounts to that reverts or relies on the existence of unconscious states. So it seems that if I cannot manage to rule out this possibility by simply saying that being an experience entails being phenomenally aware, but being phenomenally aware somehow entails the fact that there are unconscious mental states, then my idea that being an experience is the mark of the mental doesn't work. And this was the point that has been defended, for instance, by David Rosenthal in his version of the higher order theory of mental states, according to which being phenomenally aware, as you know, is cashed out at the second order level. That is, by saying that a state is phenomenally aware is if and only if it is represented by another higher order state that is directed upon the first order state. And in order to avoid an infinite regress, Rosenthal says that the second order mental state can well be unconscious. So I have to rule out this possibility by showing how being phenomenally aware can be analyzed differently. And in order to do that, I will start by an account that I, for some sense, find very congenial, which is the idea that has been recently defended by Sam Coleman, even though Sam wants to pursue this idea in a different direction, because he wants to exploit the idea that his idea of qualitative character can be the mark of the mental. But I want to stress this idea in a different way. That is, some maintains that being mental is being qualitative. By qualitative, it means something that can be either conscious or unconscious, right? So there can be, according to him, qualitative unconscious mental states, which sounds a sort of weird theory, because some people might say, well, but there is a contradiction in terms here, which I think is not the case. And in fact, one can give an account of what qualitative properties in this sense are. For instance, one might say, well, they are intrinsic properties, and by take them as intrinsic properties, one might take them as material properties in some sense, or cerebral properties. So one can say, well, if this is the case, if the qualitative can be something that is unconscious, well, how can this idea be exploited in some sense that goes in my direction? Well, because it is possible to maintain that qualitative properties are intrinsic in this sense, that is, that they are material or cerebral properties, and yet it is only when they contribute to determine an experience that they count as mental. And in a sense that goes back at least to Kim, both mental versus experiential states and cerebral states, one might say, if one buys Kim's picture of events, one might say that both these things consist in the instantiations of the very same properties. But, okay, so one may say, well, but this is a materialist account, because if you say that mental states and physical states are the instantiations of just one and the same property, how can you defend the idea that being mental amounts to being an experience? Well, because the fact that the two events amount to the instantiations of the same property does not mean that the property is instantiated in the same way. There is a possibility of accounting for the fact that one and the same property can be predicated in different ways, and one of these two ways, in my mind, is relevant for the identification of what being an experience amounts to, and then what the mark of the mental actually consists in. So let me show how the idea might come out this way, okay? I don't want to defend the idea that there are so-called subjective properties, right? I don't want to say that there is anything like the fact that when I am undergoing a particular state of pain, I'm endorsing a particular property and you are endorsing a different properties because in a sense, your property is your property and my property is my property. I don't want to exploit this idea because otherwise such properties would be, of course, unshareable. And in order just to take a suggestion from this idea, but not to exploit that, I want to say instead the following, that is that both an experiential state and the underlying physical state are different just because they amount, on the one hand, to the instantiation of the very same qualitative property in Coleman's sense, that is a property that might be intrinsic in Coleman's sense, for instance, the property of activating C fibers, or the property of being a pain that constitutes a first-order mental state, right? But then, notwithstanding the fact that the very same property is instantiated, the idea is that the mental state and the underlying physical state, for instance, when you are undergoing a particular pain, the state of pain and the corresponding underlying event that takes place in our brain are different, precisely because in them the very same property, which is either the property of, in this case, of activating C fibers or being a pain, is instantiated in different modes that I call a constitutive mode and a non-constitutive one. And so different modes of instantiation of one and the same property correspond to different modes of predication of the property when these predications are true. And I also take it that the constitutive mode of predication, because of the way I will define it, is a subjective mode for it characterizes the subject that is the property instantiator. Because if you appeal to Kim's picture of events, you say, well, events are instantiations of properties that are instantiated by something. So the subject here plays the role of the instantiator, right? But this constitutive mode of predication, as I will try to show, is also featured by phenomenal awareness. So this is the idea that in its amounting to a qualitative property or an intrinsic property, the experiential state is featured by a first-order phenomenal character in which the so-called subjective and qualitative aspect, the fact that it is a state for someone, and the fact that it is a state that characterizes a certain what it is like, are merely conceptually distinguishable elements, but not different constitutive factors. And I will try to show why. By appealing to an idea that has been developed in a completely different field of research in philosophy, in order to deal with a famous problem concerning how you can truthfully predicate a property of a fictional character. So, completely different story. For instance, we intuitively take it that Madame Bovary is a woman, or that Sherlock Holmes is a detective. And then, of course, immediately the question arises, how can Madame Bovary can it be a woman since she is a fictional character? A fictional character cannot be a woman. And many people in the so-called Meinongian tradition have said that you have precisely to revert to the idea that one and the same property can be predicated in different ways, what they call the internal and the external one. So as a result, one and the same property may be predicated of a fictional character in different ways, or it's predicating a property in predicating the property. The copula that plays this sort of predicational role is ambiguous between the internal and the external meaning. I try to give you some example, right? For instance, consider the, now you cannot see that. There is an interesting problem. How can it be the case that Sherlock Holmes exists if it is a fictional character? Because fictional characters do not exist. If you get into the Siena Cathedral in order to look for Sherlock Holmes, you are completely misled. For Sherlock Holmes is not in the cathedral, but is not anywhere else in the world. And one might say, well, but it's precisely the fact that the property of existence is predicated of Sherlock Holmes in one sense. It is an internal property because this is what Conan Doyle says. Sherlock Holmes, in the perspective of the story, is a full-fledged individual that exists just like us. But in the external way, Sherlock Holmes does not exist, right? In the other way of predicating a property, Sherlock Holmes does not share this very property as we instead share. So this is the difference between us and Sherlock Holmes. Now we can apply this distinction to my case, because consider the following two states. Consider the physical states of my activation of the C fiber and the experiential state of my being in pain. Okay, or you can change the example if you like. And I take it that these are two different states, for they amount to different modes of instantiation. The non-constitutive and the constitutive one. The non-constitutive regards the physical state, the cerebral state, and the constitutive regards the mental state of one and the same qualitative or intrinsic property in Coleman's sense, or again, which is the same in the relevant predication. The copula has such different meanings truly predicated of them. So for instance, I am a C fiber activator in a non-constitutive sense, but I feel pain, sorry because it's not shown here in the slides, in a constitutive way, right? Same property, but predicated in different ways of one and the same subject. And of course, it is not enough just to say that the property is predicated so if you like, in the internal way, in the case of the mental state, and in the external way, in the case of a physical state, because if we stick to the way in which the internal mode of predication can be determined and defined, you do not get consciousness, because the definition that has been provided is that a property is internally possessed by something, even only if it belongs to the property sets that a particular fictional character is constituted with. So, for instance, to give you an example, if I say that Madame Bovary is a woman, and I say that the property being a woman is predicated internally of Madame Bovary, this means that the property of being a woman figures in the set of properties that constitute Madame Bovary, that is intrinsically associated to Madame Bovary. Madame Bovary is something to which you can list a certain series of properties that are the properties that are predicated to her, in this case by Flaubert in his famous story. But of course, the constitutive mode of predication that I mobilize in the case of mental states must be something more than that, because it has to also account for the fact that being phenomenally aware is involved in this story, because the subject is not only characterized by certain qualitative versus cerebral properties, it's not just merely constituted by such properties, by the qualitative properties, in the very same sense in which a fictional character might be constituted by the properties that are predicated out of that, but the subject is also affected by the phenomenological relevant aspect of such a predication mode, right? And so you have to add a further element in the story, that is that unlike the underlying physical states, as regards experiential states, that the instantiated qualitative properties they consist of are presented to the subject that is so characterized. And that is, the subject is phenomenally aware of conscious of such properties. That is, phenomenal awareness in this account amounts to the fact that a certain qualitative property is presented to a certain subject that is constituted out of this property. This is an idea that, for instance, Franz Brentano might have also, in a sense, accepted. And this is what phenomenal awareness actually amounts to. The fact that a state is phenomenally aware lies in the fact that the instantiated qualitative property it consists of is presented or manifested to its subject. And this is an idea that has been recently exploited in a different way by so-called acquaintance theories of phenomenal awareness, according to which phenomenal awareness is not a matter of representation, as the higher order theorists believe, but it's a matter of acquaintance, if you like, the fact that the subject is acquainted with certain properties. But in those accounts, at least those that I know, they do not appeal to the idea that a certain qualitative property is presented in a particular way that constitutes the way in which the property is predicated. They are appealing to different sorts of relations, or for instance, let me see if it is here, it's not here, but well, where is it? I wanted to go back. Okay. So, for instance, in some accounts, such as the account that Martina Niederrümer defends, the idea is that what is predicated of a subject is the complex property of, for a sort of property, such as, for instance, a property of blueness, to be presented to a certain subject. And Martinez says that this very property, being presented as blue to a subject, is what is the subject is acquainted with. right? And whereas in my account, I want to split the presentational factor, but not taking it as a constituent of the relevant experiential property. The property is just, if you like, whatever property it is. That is, for instance, in the case of a pain, the property of having a certain C fibers activation, if you like. And this very property, not the property of being presented as a certain property, is the relevant property that is predicated in a particular way by appealing to the presentational factor. So I can get to a definition of my constitutive mode of predication, which goes this way. A property is constitutively predicated of something if and only if it is internally predicated of it, in the very same sense in which a property is internally predicated of a fictional character, that is, it belongs to the set of properties that are associated to a certain particular individual, just in the very same sense in which for Madame Bovary is a woman. But there is also another factor that is involved here, that is the fact that that very property is presented or manifested to that something, and therefore it is something that is phenomenally aware or conscious. And I take it that this particular way in which a property is predicated of something accounts for the fact that, as people say in this tradition, a phenomenal character must be something that is phenomenally manifest, right? That is something that has a certain particular what it is like, and therefore a sort of conscious factor on the one end. And on the other end, the fact that there is a sort of what these people called an intimacy between the phenomenal character itself and the awareness, the phenomenal awareness of such character. And in fact, there is this intimacy. This fact that there is this intimacy in my account is explained by the fact that the relevant property is predicated in this particular way. So an experiential state as a subjective qualitative, the two factors are taken together, phenomenal character, if and only if characterizing qualitative property, being a pain or whatever, is constitutively instantiated. Okay, so in this account, phenomenal character is no content at all. It's just the mode for a qualitative property to be constitutively predicated. Now, I don't have time to show that because of lack of time, but if there were time, I would show to you that many traditional problems that arise in philosophy of mind can find a new solution. One might show why this account is naturalist. One might show why there is a metaphysical possibility of inverted spectra, but there is no such possibilities for zombies. And finally, the famous Mary problem can be solved quite easily. Unfortunately, I do not have time to show all of that, but all these things are consequences that follow from the fact that I take it that the fact that this property is the qualitative or cerebral property, if you like, is presented in a particular way, and this presentation has to do with the way in which the property is instantiated by its relevant instantiator, right, accounts for this idea that being an experience is something that entails phenomenal awareness. And if I manage to do so, my original problem that was to show the appealing to phenomenal awareness in order to account for the mark of the mental, for the necessary and sufficient conditions in order for something to be mental, does not lead me out of the realm of experiences. Because remember, if you want to say that being an experience is the mark of the mental, you have to rule out whatever is not experienced as figuring within the mark of the mental. So definitely you have to rule out for instance, second-order mental states, if such second-order mental states are taken to be unconscious, as is supposed to be the case, for instance, in Rosenthal higher-order theory. I think I can stop here. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew Mertsalov. Here I am representing the Moscow Center for Consciousness Studies and the Lomonosov Moscow State University. I'm very happy to be here, and first of all, I'd like to say my words of gratitude to the International Center for Consciousness Studies and to its co-founders, Pietro Perconti and Dmitry Volkov, who made this conference possible. Also, a lot of thanks to Riccardo Manzotti, who helps to organize this conference, and for all the hosts and guests of this conference, without whom this conference would be impossible. My topic is personal identity and moral responsibility. It is a bit delusive, because really I will not talk about the relation between personal identity and moral responsibility. I will talk about the relation, about the meta-theoretical relation of theories of personal identity and theories of moral responsibility, concerning the question of whether the personal identity over time is a necessary condition of moral responsibility. So my goal is to defend three claims. According to the so-called Strassonian theories of moral responsibility, for some person now to be morally responsible for some past action, this person now must be the same person as the person who previously performed this action. The second thesis I'd like to defend is that personal identity over time, as it is understood in the leading theories of personal identity, doesn't matter for moral responsibility, as it is understood in the Strassonian theories. Between these two claims, there seems to be a tension. And indeed, because of the active but mostly independent development of these theoretical fields in the last 50 years, this field suffers from some miscoordination. Nevertheless, I think there is no dramatic contradictions between them, and so my third claim would be that at least some of the leading theories of personal identity fit perfectly with the Strassonian theories of moral responsibility. I think that can be treated as a kind of meta-theoretical advantage of these theories, and I will say about it a bit in the conclusion. So let's turn to the Strassonian theories of moral responsibilities. First of all, some clarification remarks. Hereafter, I will talk when I will talk about these theories, I will mean only theories of personal as opposite to the collective responsibility, retrospective, that concerns past action as opposite to prospective responsibility, related more to the deontology and ethics of duty, and about moral responsibility theories as distinct from causal, legal, and other kinds of responsibility. And I will also confine myself only to the Strassonian theories, just because they are the dominant group of the theories of personal identity nowadays in the literature. So I believe they are really our best theories of moral responsibility nowadays. Well, they are called Strassonian since they inherit much of the common traits from the account of Sir Peter Strawson. His freedom and resentment has become in many ways fundamental to much of the contemporary debates about moral responsibility. What about the characteristic traits of this approach? Well, Strawson shifts the focus from the question, what does it mean for someone to be morally responsible, that was the focus of the discussion of previous tradition, to the question, what are the conditions of the appropriateness of holding someone morally responsible? According to Strawson, to hold a person morally responsible is to take what he calls a reactive attitude toward this person. By the reactive attitude, he means a natural human emotional response provoked by actions or inactions of others, like gratitude, resentment, indignation, etc. Strawson stressed that while these reactive attitudes are usually caused or provoked by actions of others. The reactive attitudes are essentially reactions to the quality of others' will toward us as manifested in their behavior, to their goodwill, affection, or esteem on the one hand, or contempt, indifference, or malevolence on the other. In that sense, to be morally responsible is to be an appropriate target of the reactive attitude. Sometimes these reactions can be inappropriate, and these are the cases where, after some consideration, we find an excuse that decreases the degree of our moral reactions or even withdraw it altogether. So Strawson analyzes such kind of excuses and combines them into two big classes that could be formulated as conditions for the appropriateness of holding a person morally responsible. These two conditions can be found almost in every Strawsonian theory. In general, it can be stated that to be morally responsible for some action, that is, to be an appropriate target of a relevant reactive attitude, a person should be a moral agent and an agent of this action he is to be held responsible for. So, first of all, to be an appropriate target of any reactive attitude, a person should be a moral agent, a one who is in principle capable to be a full-fledged participant of moral relationship and a member of the moral community. For this condition to be satisfied, a person who is holding to be morally responsible should have some relevant moral capacities. Otherwise, if a person is morally undeveloped or incapacitated in some or all respects, to hold this person morally responsible will be inappropriate. The second, to be an appropriate target of some particular reactive attitude provoked by some action, a person must be an agent of this action. That means that this action must be correctly attributed to this person. For an action to be correctly attributed to a person, in a sense that is relevant for moral responsibility for it, this action should manifest or express the quality of will of that person, where this expression relation means that this action should be causally dependent on the attitude of good or ill will, and the content of this attitude should be correctly displayed in this action. The quality of will is a link that fastens an action to a person, makes it possible to attribute this action to a person in a sense that is relevant to the appropriateness of holding this person morally responsible for that action. If this connection is disrupted, we usually consider that it is inappropriate to hold a person morally responsible. But what are these moral capacities and quality of will? Well, in different theories of moral responsibility and for different kinds of moral responsibility that are sometimes distinguished, they can be understood differently. For example, the quality of the will can be understood in terms of good or ill will, good or bad attitudes toward other people, good or bad character traits, approved or disapproved judgments, and so on. The relevant moral capacities can be understood as the ability of self-government in some minimal sense, as the ability just to conduct according to one's aims and desires. Or it can be understood as the ability to control one's action in more or less demanding way that may include free will, reason responsiveness, empathy, the ability to understand other desires and normative perspective, and so on. However different these interpretations are in various Strawsonian theories, they can be generalized. We can say that in all the Strawsonian theories, the quality of will means morally positive or negative, stable psychological traits of a person. And moral capacities are morally relevant cognitive capacities. Not all the Strawsonian theories treat these two conditions as sufficient. Sometimes they also include some epistemic condition, for example. But all the Strawsonian theories include these two in one or another interpretation as necessary conditions for the appropriateness of holding a person morally responsible. So they are at least some of the Strawsonian necessary conditions. In the Strawsonian theories, these conditions are usually considered in an a temporal way, without specification at what moment a person should satisfy them. However, the moment of the action and the moment of holding someone responsible for it don't have to coincide and usually do not coincide. And obviously, if a person satisfies these conditions of agency of action and of moral agency at one moment, it doesn't guarantee that this person will satisfy them at another moment. However, it can be shown that to be morally responsible now for some past action, a person should be a moral agent and an agent of this action both at the moment of action and at the moment when she is held to be morally responsible. Shown by the opposite. There are 4 options to consider that are summarized on the slide in the second paragraph. Suppose a person now is a moral agent and has some relevant quality of will, but at the moment of action he was incapacitated, say he had no control over his action. Then he wasn't a moral agent. Or suppose that at the moment of action he didn't have relative quality of will. In that case, the action cannot be attributed to this person in a sense that is relevant for moral responsibility for it. In both cases, it would be inappropriate to hold him responsible for that action. But the same goes if a person ceases to be moral agent or an agent of this action by the moment when he is to be held morally responsible. Because of some mental disease or maybe radical change of her personality over time, a person may lose some of her cognitive capacities or psychological traits that constitute her status as a moral agent and as an agent of some action. And in that case, it would be inappropriate to hold this person morally responsible for that action. To be moral agent and an agent of the action at both moments, a person now, when she is held to be morally responsible, should preserve the same moral capacities and the same quality of will a person at the moment of action had. Unless this condition doesn't work properly alone, since there could be cases where a person now who have the same moral capacities and the same quality of will and a person who had them at the moment of action are just different persons. Imagine a hooligan who steals apple in the neighbor's garden, expressing his ill will and hooliganic character. And suppose that the next night his ill will, these character traits, transplanted to some different and totally innocent person. So the next morning, the person who have the quality of will the hooligan had at the moment of action is a different person. Intuitively, it seems obvious that to blame and to punish this result of person for hooligans' deeds would be inappropriate. So to make this last condition work properly, unless the translation close this paragraph, but I will read it anyway. To make this condition work properly, it should be supplemented. We should say that to hold a person morally responsible now for some past action can be appropriate only if a person who is held to be morally responsible now is the same person as a person who committed this action previously. That is why we can say that, that is my first claim, according to the Strassonian theories, for some person now to be morally responsible for some past action, this person now must be the same person as the person who previously performed this action. The Strassonian theories usually do not have any conceptual tools to analyze and to clarify what does it mean for a person at one moment to be the same person at another moment. What are the conditions for preservation of a person over time, and etc. These questions are traditionally fall within the purview of the theories of personal identity. Within the theories of personal identity, the relation to be the same person as a person at some other moment is commonly interpreted as a relation of numerical personal identity. But this interpretation seems to be inadequate to the Strassonian theories, since and that is my second claim, personal identity over time, as it is understood in the leading theories of personal identity, doesn't matter for the Strassonian moral responsibility. By our leading theories of personal identity, I mean, first of all, the substantialism, the narrative approach, the biological approach, and the psychological theory. So let's go straight into the substantialism and take a look at it. According to substantialism, person is a purely mental substance, like Cartesian ego or a soul, that is irreducible to any physical or psychological properties, independent from them and can exist without them. To be the same person as a person at some other moment here is understood as a numerical identity relation. Being the same person cannot be analyzed in terms of having some of the same body or the same physical or mental properties, as Richard Swinburne says. So being the same person here is understood also as an irreducible relation to some more basic properties. According to Swinburne, to be morally responsible for some action, it is necessary and sufficient for a person to be numerically identical to a person who acted expressing her quality of will. Swinburne is talking about moral judgments, and possessing relevant capacities. Swinburne is talking about free will here. And he stresses that human, in his or her essence, exactly the same, who did some action 20 years ago for which they were then morally responsible, would be no less responsible for that action as a result of any change of character, memory, or bodily constitution. Since the appropriateness of holding a person morally responsible in substantialism doesn't depend on her status of moral agent and an agent of action, because it doesn't depend on her preservation of her moral capacities and the quality of will, the moral responsibility at issue here is not a Strassonian moral responsibility. Even if substantialist personal identity is necessary for moral responsibility understood differently, for example, in the basic desert sense or for post-mortem atonement sense, as Swinburne uses it. This understanding of moral responsibility is different from the Strassonian, and the substantialist personal identity doesn't matter for the Strassonian moral responsibility. According to Daniel Dennett, Maria Schechtman, Arthur McIntyre, and also Dmitry Volkov, who are the proponents of the narrative approach, a person is an abstract or a fictive object that is defined by the autobiographical narrative of that person. To be the same person is understood here also as a numerical identity relation that is provided by the unity of the narrative that characterizes the person. All that belongs to the autobiographical narrative characterize the same person. Here the re-identification question, that is the question whether a person at one moment is identical with a person at another moment, depends on the characterization question. That is, what are the traits, beliefs, actions, etc. that can be attributed to that person. For an action to be attributed to a person, it should belong to the autobiographical narrative of that person in coherent and intelligible way. So, and being realistically and teleologically explained by other parts of that narrative. So to belong to autobiographical narrative, this action should a person should be able to articulate what he did and explain it. To be coherently included in this narrative, it should not contradict with other elements of this narrative. To be intelligible, it should be explainable by other elements of the narrative. And it should be explainable in realistic manner. That means that there should be some evidence of this action. And in teleological matter, the aims of an agent should also explain these actions. As Dmitry Volkov says in his book about free will and moral responsibilities, it is the possibility to include some mental and physical events without a contradiction in a consistent, realistic autobiography that makes these events and characteristics part of the essence and true identity of a person. And it is also the basis of her moral responsibility for the relevant actions. The numerical identity is a necessary condition for the attribution of actions to a person and the appropriateness of holding this person morally responsible for that actions according to the narrative view. Unless the conditions of attribution of actions to a person and the appropriateness of holding this person morally responsible for that action in the narrative theory are distinct from analogous conditions in the Strassonian theories. There can be the cases where a person is a moral agent and an agent of some action according to the Strassonian theories, but this action cannot be included into the autobiographical narrative of that person. It contradicts many of its elements, cannot be explained within it, neither realistically nor teleologically, etc. These could be the cases of an act that a person is ashamed of, and he is trying to forget about them and forget them, whether they are good or bad. And there can be cases where a person is neither a moral agent nor an agent of some action according to the Strassonian theories, but since this action has already been included into the autobiographical narrative of this person, according to the narrative theory, it can be appropriate to hold this person morally responsible for that action. So even if narrativistic personal identity is necessary for some kind of moral responsibility, it doesn't matter for the Strassonian moral responsibility. What about the biological approach that one of the proponents, or the main proponents of which is Erik Olson? According to the biological approach, human persons are human animals. A person is identical to its body or organism. To be the same person here is also understood as a numerical identity relation. Numerical identity is provided here by the special temporal bodily continuity, as Williams claims, or the retaining of the organization of parts of the organism, according to Mackey, or the continuity of life-sustaining vegetative functions, as Erik claims. The preservation of personal identity here is also independent from reservation of any psychological properties of a person, including moral capacities and quality of will, and vice versa. There are cases where the Strassonian conditions are satisfied without biological personal identity, like in cases of the brain transplantation. Analyzing such cases in human animal, Erik concludes that the traditional view is that you are responsible for something just in case you did it and you are psychologically continuous with yourself as you were then. But if the biological approach is true, we cannot have it both ways. We can tie these practical relations of moral responsibility to psychological continuity, or we can tie them to numerical identity, but we cannot tie them to both. So, no spending the time to prove how much I agree with Erik at this point. I will just say that the Strassonian moral responsibility can be tied to, cannot be tied to the biological personal identity. So biological identity doesn't matter for the Strassonian moral responsibility. The last big bunch of theories of personal identity of the contemporary theories of personal identity is the psychological approach. According to it, persons are constituted by their psychological features. The standard conceptual scheme of the psychological theory can be set up by the distinction between the numerical identity, R relation, psychological continuity, and psychological connectedness. Psychological connectedness can be defined as a holding of particular direct psychological connections, where the direct psychological connection roughly can be understood as the direct preservation in time of some psychological feature, a character trait or a belief or an attitude, etc. Psychological connectedness is a matter of degree. It can be stronger or weaker depending on whether there are more or less direct psychological connections. And we can say that there is a strong psychological connectedness if there are enough direct connections. How much of them will be enough? Well, it depends on the theory of personal identity. But for my purpose, following Derek Parfit, we can assume that there is strong connectedness if the number of direct connections over any day is at least half of the number that hold over every day in the lives of nearly every actual person. With this degree of psychological connectedness in hand, we can determine psychological continuity as holding of overlapping chains of strong psychological connectedness. Even if a person is weakly psychological connected with himself many years ago, if through all these years they hold an overlapping chains of strong connectedness day to day, we can say the person today is psychologically continues with this person years ago. Psychological continuity can hold because of different causes. The normal cause of psychological continuity seems to be the continuous existence of our brains. But psychological theorists can adapt that some other kinds of causes can also do the job, as in the case of teleportation, for example. In any case, the psychological continuity with the right kind of cause is what is called the relation R. And it is precisely the relation R that is a cornerstone of the psychological theory. According to the psychological view, the R relation is what numerical personal identity consists in. But these relations are not equal. Numerical identity is always a 1-1 relation, when the relation R can also take a 1-many form as well, as in the duplication cases, for example. So it can be said that numerical identity is just a kind of the relation R. Precisely, it is a non-branching relation R. In most of the other theories of personal identity, the relation to be the same person as a person at some other moment is understood as a numerical identity relation. But the psychological theorists need not to adopt this interpretation. They can claim that a person at one moment acts at T1, but the rest is covered. The person at one moment is the same as the person at some other moment if and only if they are related. The proponents of the psychological approach can claim that, at least in the context of moral responsibility, branching or non-branching of the relation R doesn't matter. Suppose, for example, that 2 minutes ago some Martians using their progressive technologies to scan the whole of your body and brain, all of your psychological features, and made the exact replica of you on Mars, that is physically and psychologically exact like you were 2 minutes ago. That is the example where the relation R branches. But obviously that doesn't mean that now it is inappropriate to ascribe you the action committed by a person that was sitting on your place 2 minutes ago, nor that you are no more responsible for the actions of that previous person. This interpretation allows psychological theory to clarify the Strassonian conditions of the appropriateness of holding a person morally responsible. According to the Strassonian theories, to be morally responsible now for some actions, a person now should, first of all, be the same person as a person who committed that action in the past, and secondly, preserve the same moral capacities and quality of will that constitute the moral agency and an agency of action. the proponents of the psychological approach can reformulate these conditions, saying that to be morally responsible now for some past action, a person now should be related with the person who committed this action in the past, and secondly, be psychological connected in respect to the relevant moral capacities and quality of will with the person who committed that action in the past. There are a lot of well-known cases that seems to be problematic to the psychological theory in the context of moral responsibility question. I have no time to discuss them into the details, but I hope it would be enough to say that most of them are based either on the interpretation of the relation to be the same person as the identity relation, or on the ignoring of the Strassonian conditions of moral responsibility. And since both of these grounds can be denied by the theoretics of the psychological approach, these counter-arguments do not threat the psychological approach. While the relation to be the same person as a person at some other moment is usually understood as a numerical identity relation, it is not the only option, as the psychological approach tells us. Conceptual tools of the psychological theory of personal identity helps to distinguish two relations. First of them, to be the same person, that is relation R that allows branching, and second is to be one and the same person. That is the numerical identity, the relation R without branching. And here we're coming to my third claim, that at least some of the leading theories of personal identity, the psychological theory, seems to fit perfectly with the Strassonian theories of moral responsibility. Of course, it can be the case that the Strassonian theories are wrong, or that the theories of personal identity we have nowadays are totally wrong. But it seems that today we have nothing better. And in contrast to its rivals, the psychological theory helps to clarify what kind of preservation of a person over time is necessary for the Strassonian moral responsibility, for the conditions of moral agency and agency of action to be satisfied. That makes it a preferable theory of personal identity in the light of our best theories of moral responsibility. Thank you very much.